I'd like to invite Dr. Cooper to join us as well, if she can, and we can have a little bit of a discussion here. I think one of the main things that came up for me was that, does the US offer a level playing field for all of these different kinds of people? You shared an article, it's among the resources of a Dalit who is pursuing a PhD at Harvard, for instance. But is that really the case?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I was looking at the chat a little bit when you started the question. I'm so sorry, Denzel.
I was just wondering, given the diverse backgrounds of Black immigrants and South Asian immigrants and what they face in their home countries, how they're perceived in the US, is the US some sort of level playing field for them?
Right. I think that, there's always this kind of way in which we can think like, maybe when I come here to this other space, that same space isn't going to be there. Like, for instance, there's a lot of segregation in caste, with castes in India. You might have an entire village that is considered a Dalit village. Well, that's not going to happen in the United States. So it seems like you can escape these issues. And a lot of people might not feel like they face very much discrimination in comparison to what they get in India, knowing the difference, like always having that basis of comparison, right? Or students who grow up in the United States might not have been told by their parents. There's a Dalit activist named Thenmozi Sundarajan who has written a book where called The Trauma of Caste, where she starts talking about the fact that her parents never told her her caste status, which was Dalit, in a way to say like, okay, we're going to move beyond this, right? So there's a lot of that. And I think there's this aspiration, of course, like when people migrate, there's an aspiration to not just like leave some of the discriminations behind, but to, do that American dream. Right. So I think that there's a lot of that in South Asian migration as well.
Dr. Cooper, did you want to chime in?
Yes, I just wanted to acknowledge that, like you, Dr. Thomas, the chat is just alive and well, and I'm just enjoying it. There's just a lot of similarities, right? I mean, you say like, ideally, what is the American dream? But for some of us, it could be an American nightmare, right? I mean, when you look at where some Black immigrant populations settle, they may, be in an underfunded or under-resourced community. What access do they have to a quality education? Or perhaps maybe they're living in food desert. There are just so many variables. Someone asked earlier in the chat around what were some of the main challenges for Black immigrant populations. And I kind of thought it's just that. It's what is the experience to be Black in America, even if you yourself don't necessarily identify as Black initially, right? I mean, you very much can check off whatever you would like. You can write in your country of origin or whatever, that may be. Of course, that is your choice. That is your right. However, how you navigate the space could look vastly different depending upon, your skin color. Of course, there are just so many similarities there. So I just kind of want us to sit with that. I also had an opportunity to publish a co-authored piece in the California TESOL Journal with two colleagues, Dr. Keisha Bryan and Mary Romney, and we entitled it The Illusion of Inclusion, right? Like we have this idea that we're so inclusive and everyone belongs, but that's not necessarily the case. And so as we think about, is everyone here? Is everyone included? Does everyone belong? How are we, using our own privilege, if you will, to make sure that we are doing all the work, but unintentionally creating additional barriers? That's something I work a lot with educators in the K-12 space. Let's make sure we are not creating additional barriers unintentionally.
One of the things you both spoke of is the tremendous diversity of backgrounds and how easy it is to pigeonhole in the US as African American, as Indian American, despite the tremendous diversity. I mean, I come from a Afro-Caribbean mixed background. My last name is Mohammed. I grew up Presbyterian. Where do I fit in? How should teachers, sort of approach their students when it comes to these issues of identity?
Okay, and please tell me, are you asking how in the school settings are we helping to support student identity?
Just in terms of understanding students' identities, given the complexities that they arrive with.
Sure, sure. I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is a better job of asking students, right? I mean, like, where do we even create that opportunity with identity development, or how they might identify, and what that means, right? And some of the labels, right? And we're so label driven. Some of those labels may shed over time, right? And that's allowable too, right? I mean, at one point, a student may say, I am American first. I may not lead with I am from, XYZ country first. Maybe they have, just recently became a citizen, and that piece of their identity is something they're celebrating. So there's a lot of dynamics to it, but I definitely would say that in the K to 12 space, as you can see, any talk around, I mean, look at the banned book list, right? Like, there's just so many places where when we're attempting to make sure that those things are included in centering on students, unfortunately, sometimes they can be perceived as threatening, or just topics that don't belong in a K to 12 space, but they're definitely impacted by the students that we serve.
If I could jump in on that too, like I see a lot of questions on the chat saying like, how do you know someone's caste? And I'd like to echo what Dr. Cooper just said, like listening to the students themselves, like we need to center Dalit Bahujan voices. I think that that's very important. And it's hard to know, I think, for non-South Asian Americans. Sometimes some of the discriminations and slurs can be very regional specific or language specific, and you might not know it's happening. I'm not telling educators that we need to know everything, right? But if we listen to Dalit Bahujan students, we can hear some of the stories that they talk about. I saw in the chat too, people are asking, like, you can tell with the name. We have other forms of discrimination that we don't have marker for. Think of sexuality, and still we can protect peoples who come from, queer communities, right? So we can still protect Dalit students even if we don't know or try and find out their caste, right? Because like I said, outing somebody's caste. Name is maybe one of them, but it's not foolproof. There's no foolproof way to know someone's caste. And there's always people might be trying to find out. So, like they'll say, like, where are you from? Well, when you have issues of segregation, that could lead to more things. What religion are you? Many Dalit peoples have converted to Christianity or Buddhism, right? Like, what types of foods do you eat? What is your last name? Many Brahmin men wear a sacred thread. Are you wearing that thread? There are different ways in which people try and find out your caste in not a very innocuous way. They're trying to see if they will be part of your social group or let you into theirs or not, right? And that's where a lot of the discriminations come from those types of exclusions and creation of a culture where other peoples are harmed. Another way is like if we see affirmative action policies in India have led to this kind of discussion of reverse racism that Dalit students are getting in at a college level, and because they didn't get in on merit, they got in on affirmative action policies, so they're not as qualified. So that kind of stereotype exists. And if you have children, Dalit parents in schools, that idea of you're not as good of a student as us could replay into the next generation, because again, this is a form of descent-based discrimination.
Speaking on that topic of stereotypes, Dr. Cooper, one thing we know from the broad data is that African immigrants are actually some of the most highly educated in the US. Can you speak a little bit more about the stereotypes and realities?
Sure, I can. And again, I'm just clicking save chat, because I definitely want to follow up with people. These are some great questions. Before I get into the stereotypes piece, I just want to make sure that we're really understanding the importance of holding ourselves and the institutes that we're affiliated with accountable for all of the above. We can't do this alone. The students can't do it alone. We shouldn't put it on someone else to, recreate a system to make it better for them that they didn't create in the first place. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that we are understanding that we're in this together. How are we holding ourselves and the institutes that we're working with accountable for this work? I think that's really important. And that's getting back to the issues of stereotypes. Again, when teachers look at students and you say, oh, these are the Black students, what myths or misconceptions do they hold about who their Black students are? Have they had an opportunity to talk and learn from their multilingual Black students? There was a podcast. I will link all of this as a resource. This is wonderful. But it was a podcast, and there was a Black immigrant student who said he was trying to tell his teacher what he experienced, coming out of the Rwandan genocide. And he was talking about his experiences. And the teacher didn't believe him because it wasn't something that the teacher had, quote unquote, heard or seen on the news. Right. So it's almost like if I hadn't heard of it, it can't be true. That's a myth. That's a stereotype. Somebody's coming to you, telling you about an experience, right? Like, who are we to say if it's not on my news feed, then it's not real, it's not happening, right? So I thought that one kind of stood out. Also, when we're talking about stereotypes, again, what information are we looking at, and how are we making sure the data that we're looking at and interpreting, that the stories behind it, right, that we're able to celebrate those? Because you're absolutely right. The Black immigrant families tend to be highly educated, highly literate. There was a question around where people settle. I think that's a great question. Why do some ethnic groups settle in some communities and others get sent to another place? Why is that? Right? I mean, like, those are really great questions, but we have a lot of work to do around how others perceive our students, how the students perceive themselves. And until we get to that question, like, what are the intended outcomes? That could be, really clouded with those stereotypical myths, right? The goal for you is to have an entry-level service job. Not necessarily. What does that student want for themselves? What does that family want? What have they sacrificed to settle in this country and have really put themselves in this vulnerable position so that the next generation can be more financially stable? So there's a lot that we need to do around stereotypes and holding ourselves accountable to make sure that we're doing this work in the most just and efficient way.
Mary Kate asks, specifically for you, Dr. Thomas, many of those ways seem like similar questions to what we ask when we're trying to get to know youth that we work with. Are there ways to ask some of these getting to know you questions without concerning them that we're trying to determine their caste?
Yeah, I would say, like, I don't want to scare people off to say, like, oh, don't be too invasive or not to be too invasive. What we're doing with our students right now, I think, I do this thing with my students where I ask them, like, what would you like to be called? A questionnaire on the first day, like, where are you from? Can you name the indigenous peoples of that land? To try and orient them around the people that they're around and that we're on settler colonial society. I do something like get to know, are there any concerns? I think it's fine to keep doing that, but just to be aware that casteism could be occurring. So not that we have to know everything about it, but to believe Bahujan students, to believe Dalit students when they come forth with their stories. Like Dr. Cooper's heartbreaking story, like, I don't believe in the Rwandan genocide, right? Like, I've never heard of it, right? Like something like that, like, I've never heard of caste, can be something that could be very hard for a Dalit Bahujan student to hear. Like, if we can just stay educated, South Asian Americans are Americans. This form of discrimination exists in their communities and in other communities too. There's caste formations in Japan, caste formations in Nigeria, to say, like, okay, I've heard about this discrimination before, right? So I hope that we don't get too scared of, like, if I'm being too invasive, asking your name or where you come from, but rather, like, to think, like, okay, if I'm asking your name and where you come from, and if you tell me you're not included in a group anymore, that's the problem, right? It's just those exclusions are the problem, to just believe that those exclusions are happening, because right now we're dealing with a lot of pushback from peoples who don't want to give up a system that they benefited from, or to be told to have it be implied that they didn't get in on their own merit and they might have had a jump in issues of wealth and migration. A lot of people get very fragile about that. I think we can understand that. Nobody likes to be told that they have a lot of privilege. There's a lot of pushback. So right now, Dalit Bahujan students are coming forward with stories, and to believe them, I think, is the first important thing.
I have one from the chat. It's a question around when immigrant students arrive without knowing the history or reality of racism in the US, right? That's really standing out to me. It says Black immigrants, but really you take out the word Black and put any immigrant group, right? Like, what do immigrants in general know about the history of and reality of racism in the US? And how are we, including that in all of our experiences or learning opportunities, and how to navigate that. I think that that's something I wanted to just add, that it's not solely, not that the person was implying it, a Black immigrant piece, but I think it could be posed to the larger immigrant population in general.
And keeping with you, Dr. Cooper, in addition to refraining from telling students they should have learned this last year, what other suggestions do you have?
Oh gosh. Oh, well, aside from, in talking with teachers, it's, they definitely have to know and be willing to learn about the students in front of them. When we say you have to know your students, okay, well, what do you mean by know your students? Spend time getting to know a little bit about who they are, what they are willing to share. We don't have to know everything. Again, Dr. Thomas, we don't have to know all of it, but what would you like me to know about you? What would you like me to know about you as a learner? How do you learn best? Really, kind of centering it around, here is school, this is a learning experience. As your teacher, what do you want me to know about you and how you learn? And then let that be one of the early questions to help build a relationship and a rapport with students. We don't know if they've had other negative schooling experiences. And so just the teacher in and of itself could be someone kind of threatening. So how do we build rapport? And also as teachers, what are you willing to share about who you are? Spend a lot of time saying, right, like, who are you? But who are you? You're also showing up as part of that learning community. And so, where is your level of vulnerability with bringing your whole self into your role as the practitioner? I think that's important to include that as well.
And finally, for both of you, what opportunities are there for those in education to bring these two seemingly disparate groups, victims of casteism and racial discrimination, together to accomplish common goals?
I'll talk a little bit about that. First, there's actually a long history of global solidarity between Black and Dalit activists. So for instance, in the 1970s, a group of Dalit activists took the name Dalit Panthers and patterned their social justice activism after the Black Panthers, right? Just recently, Angela Davis, gave a statement about Dalit Lives Matter, just like Black Lives Matter. You have people who worked on, civil rights, like Bayard Rustin, who was part of the Free India campaign, right? So there's been a long history of Black and Dalit solidarity around the world. Thinking about like South Africa, there's a lot of South Africans know that Gandhi was very much saying that Indians in South Africa needed rights over Black peoples. So actually supporting the apartheid system, but saying that Indians were British citizens, so they should get to do what white people get to do, is it how basically Indian people in South Africa distance themselves from Black people. So this is why I was talking about South Asians and anti-Blackness. But you see that a lot of people in South Africa will put up statues to B.R. Ambedkar, who's a Dalit activist, right? So this Dalit Black solidarity has been there. It continues to be there. And I think that we can see that even to this day, where you see Dalit peoples fighting for Black Lives Matter, and you see Black activists fighting for Dalit Lives Matter.
And I just wanted to add, when you said, what can we do? I wanted to say, we need to hold more sessions like this. This has been so informative. And I mean, I'm just looking at the chat and listening, and I can't wait to share resources and look at the other resources that have been shared. I also would like to raffle off a copy of the edited volume and Justice for Els. I'll autograph it and send it out to the lucky winner. But we need to really create and continue to hold space for these conversations. This is not a sit and get. This is a place to come, have your cup full, and go out and continue to do the work. I have tons of ideas after being on this call, and I got invited just a few weeks ago. So thank you again for inviting me into this space. I'm so inspired. I'm so glad to be here. And I just wanted to let the group know that's what we can do. We have to keep making time and holding space so that we can be supportive of each other as we go out and continue to do the work.